so old, beauty so new.
Hello, Hofstra University. This is the voice of Sam Rocha. We're just going here on a bit of a walk right around sundown at the University of British Columbia, where I teach and work. I'd like to first thank my very good friend and colleague, Eduardo Duarte, your professor, for inviting me to be a part of this seminar, to be a part of your class, and for sharing with you the work that I've done and that we've done together. I'd also like to thank all of you, individually, personally, for taking the time to listen to that work, for taking the time to pose questions about it, and for the quality, really, of your questions, of your thoughts. I hope you won't mind if I take the time here not so much to respond to your questions individually, so much as to ask a few questions and perhaps point out some clarifications about the questions themselves. As you surely are coming to find, the intellectual rigor of asking questions is often not simply about asking questions that lead to more questions, but asking questions that themselves shake and tremble and become questionable. So it's not questions that produce any number of questions in this kind of circular pattern, but it's really more a matter of asking questions that have enough weight to them that they sort of shake and move and shift and change under the weight of the question. And I think in many ways the questions you ask certainly have that weight, certainly have that seriousness to them, certainly show a great deal of rigor, both in the ability to listen as in the ability to read and think. And so, as we take this walk, I want to first respond to the general question that addresses me as an author, the question that addresses me as the creator of the album, the question that addresses me as the one responsible for the album. As you surely know, things aren't quite so easy when it comes to authorship, and certainly it's not so easy whenever it comes to the creation of a work of art. Yes, there is a very real sense in which there is an author, and that author's external reality and relationship to the work of art has some bearing, we think, at least as long as the author can speak for himself, herself, has some bearing on what that work indeed is at some level. So when I, as an author, say, no, I object, that's not the album that you said it was, there's some weight to that, I think. Nonetheless, I think that there are very different ways in which authorship has a claim on the work of art. And in this case, I must say, my claims to this work are incredibly weak. And one of the reasons for that weakness is very straightforward. It's the problem, the beautiful problem of improvisation. So, the album was improvised, probably I would say for maybe, between 1/3 to up to half of the album was improvised. So because of this, as you might guess, there was very little that I could in some sense do about what happened on the album. Now, of course, I did a great deal of the performance of it. I played the guitar, I did the vocals, we did post-production. It's not all just, thrown together, you could say. However, I would say that there was a tremendous amount of the album that was just sort of surprised even me. If you've ever done studio work, you've probably realized this, that even what gets produced in the sort of recording process itself is changed a great deal by post-production, by engineers, by mastering, by all those things. But in this case, it's not even quite that technical. The truth of the matter is, for instance, in Alien House, that middle section of my inner self as a house divided against itself now, that section never existed before entering the studio. The musicians who were hired were friends of mine. In one case, my brother-in-law, the bass player. And they had never rehearsed any of this music because there was nothing to rehearse. It was simply in pieces and tatters and possibilities. So, to the question of authorship, there's a great deal that I don't know about this album that I've made. And that paradox, or what seems to be a paradox, is, I think, one way to question the questions that you've posed together. In other words, why were some of the lyrics selected? Why was some of the album chosen to be performed in one way versus another way? Why were there tracks with no lyrics? Well, that I can say was actually fairly intentional, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But you might even ask, and you did ask, in fact, why were certain passages used? And of course, then the larger overarching question, what was its relationship to the book, The Confessions? The book that sort of makes it, you could say, relevant to this class. Well, the answer to those questions is precisely this question that I've posed. It's very complicated. In some respects, there are things that one could say, but in many of those respects, the question is, I simply don't know. Which is also to say that even if I do think that I know, I also know that a work of art, when it's presented to an audience, when it's offered, is no longer the possession of its maker. In fact, there is nothing more mysterious to the artist than his or her own creation. I would go as far as to make the claim that there is nothing more mysterious to God than God's own creation. And in fact, this idea of the centrality of mystery and paradox at the very center of the relationship between creator and created, between art and artist, really gets to the very core, I would say, of the set of existential preoccupations that trouble and bother and drive and also console Augustine in his Confessions. So, on the question of authorship, I would only very reluctantly agree to being the author of this work, only in the sort of most superficial way, in the sense that, well, obviously, it was my idea. Yes, I've affixed my name on it. Yes, I did a great deal of the work, both the organizational work and also even the work of the performance and whatnot. But that sense of authorship is quite different than being able to, after the fact, claim some kind of authority over the text to, in some ways, give you the divine insights into what exactly it is In fact, I have to thank you again, because it was in your questions and in your remarks and in the things that you noticed and the things you chose to be attentive to that I, in some sense, saw my album as if for the very first time. I read my album anew. I heard it all over again in your questions, in your thoughts. And to that extent, it's as much your creation insofar as you're able to pose questions in that spirit as it is mine. And so we share this piece of work, we share this piece of art. We also share in the responsibility, I would say, of treating it well, and indeed, if I may, even the responsibility to love it. Now, this may sound very kind of self-aggrandizing, that the artist is asking you to love the art, and in some sense, to love him. That's sort of weird. What I mean by love in this instance, though, has very little to do with liking it. It has very little to do with sort of the shallow idea that to love something is merely to have sort of, sentimental affection for it. To love something is to recognize that the thing that is present in such a way that love is the condition for its possibility. In other words, to love an album, and therefore in some ways to love its maker, and therefore to bear the responsibility of its maker by remaking it anew, by reading it, is to love it because all of these interactions that fold and unfold and accrete and grow and change and dissipate and return and disappear, all of these sorts of things are rooted in the desire we have for them to exist. We sort of love things into being all the time. I mean, think any number of thoughts, and there you have it. Think of the beloved who I never see again. Think of Dante's La Vita Nuova. Think of any of those kinds of stories, and I think you'll see a bit of what I'm trying to point towards. At any rate, the first question I want to pose in response to a number of the questions is, who is this author? Who is this creator? Who is this maker who has the ability to tell us about the art that is made, the creation that is able to tell us about its thing that it has responsibility for? That question to me is at the very core of the album's own set of questions, which I detect in Augustine's own set of questions. You could say that Augustine constantly works between the local and the transcendent, between subsidiarity and solidarity, between the city of man and the city of God, between the sort of, at first glance, perhaps dualistic or binaries, but really it's about the ebb and the flow, the tidal movement of being in relationship to the proximate, the material, and the infinite, the eternal. The album suggests that the zone of proximity known as the self is a false zone, that it's a zone not of recognition but of misrecognition, that it's a zone that presumes too much, a zone that is unable to account for itself, but more radically a zone that is unable to account for the beyond. And so in the very first track, in the Self's Place, we encounter the question of the nostalgia one has for oneself, the sense in which one is estranged to oneself, the sense in which the self that one once perhaps thought oneself to be is no longer the same, and one perhaps longs to be that self or misses that self, and ultimately leads, though, out of that nostalgia into the desire to be with something else, in fact, to be something else. And that leads, of course, to the chorus, which is in the self's place, which is not an answer, but it places within this question this empty zone, this site in which the self cannot be found, this sense of displacement that the self needs to be set aside. And we see this over and over and on throughout Augustine's Confessions. But the truth of the matter is that Augustine's Confessions is quite simply a conversion story, which all conversion really means in the traditional sense is tied to a term called metanoia, which means nothing other than a 180-degree turn. So to have a conversion is not so much to change altogether, but it is to change in one's direction. It is to turn around. And so Augustine's Confessions is the story of the turning, of the revolutions of the soul, moved by the heart in dialogue with the mind and reason. And so the album is meant to have a sort of cyclical movement, to be spaced through a number of repetitions. One of the noted remarks in the questions, repetition, of course, calls upon the sense of revolution, of returning again and again and again to the same chorus, to the same line, to the same thing. May the acoustic genius of love resonate in your breast, right? But this conversion story is unique and remarkable precisely because it is a conversion story where we're not simply called to turn around, but where our turning around effaces the very structure of our being, where when I turn around I realize that in many ways I've always been facing this direction. I simply perhaps misled myself to believe that it was even possible to walk in the other direction. So in track 3, Show Me, fear of absent evil cannot give life breath. Here we hear Augustine in the Confessions wondering that if perhaps, since evil itself cannot be anything but a privation of the goodness of God, that perhaps the only true thing to fear is the fear of the thing that is not a thing at all. And so fear of absent evil cannot give life breath, which is to say, Augustine's conversion story is not a conversion story from A to B, the end. It's a gradual, slow ability not so much to revolve, but to return. That is to say, to turn anew, and to return to what in track 10 is said, the idea that nemo est, I am not, qui non amet, I am nothing without love. Augustine's ontology, Augustine's understanding of creation, Augustine's understanding of himself, Augustine's understanding of reality, Augustine's metaphysics, if you want to call it that, was ultimately nothing more or less than the fact that it is love that creates, sustains, and holds all things into being. And that it is love which draws us into closer relationship to being, to a being so radical that we realize that we are nothing insofar as we are outside of a relationship that is conceived through love and that is drawn by love. And so this concept of the restless heart, this notion of being late to love, is the fact that even upon arrival, we realize that the love is so real and so strong and so, in some sense, absolute that there is really no arrival that could possibly be early. And like a saying I've heard before, if you're on time, you're late. Even those who arrive on time are always late to love. Now, these words I've shared with you with regard to my album are not meant to give you official and final translations of the album or of its music, but are simply meant to let you hear anew, to repeat, as it were, the things that I believe I set out to do by making the album and its relationship to the book. But a few final words on relationship. There are at least two elementary distinctions, or two ways of thinking about the way in which we make claims to being able to describe relationships. In one case, a relationship is described through analogy. So the analogy that my sock is to my shoe as my glove is to my hand. An analogy is a very precise, one might say, way of showing a relationship between two things that often perhaps may not seem to have any relationship at all. To some extent, all art is attempting to create an analogical relationship between creation, between reality, between possibility, and the work of art, its aspirations, its hopes, its dreams, its imaginary. However, there's another kind of relationship we can think of, which is the allegory, the allegorical relationship. Allegory is a bit different because an allegory doesn't have to obey the rules of analogy. An allegory can make comparisons between things that may seem wildly unrelated, such as the love of God and the depths of the ocean. At first glance, you might say there's no relation there. But an allegorical relationship forces the mind and the heart, and even calls the soul, I would say, to consider the possibility of a more radical relationship. The relationship between things that are often unseen, unheard, unobserved, non-material, but nonetheless real, and perhaps more real than real. The reality of the unseen, the reality of the unsaid, the reality of the unimagined, the reality, you could say, of nothing. These two ways of understanding relationships, on the one hand analogy, on the other hand allegory, I think are important tools to keep in mind as you study other texts and other works of art, but in particular, especially whenever you think of art as opposed to prose or text. The grammar of language is, in some sense, hardwired for analogy. It has fairly strict rules that can only be bent to a certain degree before they break and fall apart, and we lose communication. But allegory is also built into language. In fact, you could say that we recognize language as language precisely because of our ability to take on an act of faith almost in the glyph, in the shape, in the color that presents itself before our eyes as language. Whenever we talk of sound, whenever we talk of lyrics, but especially when we don't talk of lyrics, I think the challenge is to bring ourselves to a place where we're able to set aside the analogical and accept and even embrace the allegorical, where you can even perhaps set aside the most literal analogical relationships between the Confessions and Late to Love and begin to think about the more hidden mysteries that might be there. And when you do that, as I said at the beginning, you become the author. You breathe life into this creation that without a listener, in some sense, dies. The final thing I'd like to say is there's an exercise you can take up if you want to do this, either in the form of sight or in the form of sound. If you look at the cover of the album, you may know that that cover is the skin of a pear. And if you read the Confessions, you can make the allegorical connection and relationship between the pear story, the stealing of pears, and the pear skin. That's the analogical. That's to analogize between the two things. However, look at the pear skin, and don't look at it as a pear skin, but look at it as shape and color and dimension, and find inside of it something completely new. Frankly, the only reason I chose the pear skin, while I was guided by the analogical, I chose it because I found it to be extremely beautiful. I chose it because it made me analogize into allegory between papyrus and parchment, and wonder what Augustine wrote on when he wrote the Confessions, and think about the quill pen, and think about the calligraphy that my sister drew for it. And you can see how this can go on and on. But it doesn't have to come from the side of the maker. You are the maker. You make it and remake it. You turn it and return to it. You are able to revolutionize it, quite literally, by returning. And insofar as you're doing that, you are doing the folk phenomenology of conversion. Conversion isn't just a religious experience, but in some ways, all conversions are always already religious, in the sense that they bring us into deep relationship with the present, the past and the future, with time, with eternity, with the material world, and the world that may possibly be outside of time and space and matter. So I would invite you to return perhaps to the cover of the album, but then to let that material engagement with the eye, that ocular encounter between eye and thing or object, let it happen through your ears then. Pick up any one of the tracks with no lyrics, and instead of trying to figure it out, to crack the puzzle, disabuse yourself of the assumption that there's a puzzle there to begin with. just let yourself listen and hear and imagine and be and dwell. And it's that dwelling, I would claim, it's in that radical moment of return and return into being where the self is displaced and where we may find ourselves in love. And in that love, I leave you with your class. Thank you so much.